Today's learning goal is to evaluate approaches to protecting Earth's biodiversity. Start out by taking a look at the differences between conservation and preservation biology. Conservation biology is the sustainable use and management of natural resources. It's focused on conserving and restoring damaged ecosystems and populations. Conservation biologists don't necessarily want to exclude humans from reserves or from interacting with other organisms in the environment. They don't consider harvesting or hunting of species to be a bad thing as long as it's done sustainably. They have a strong belief in the intrinsic value of biodiversity, but it's still an anthropogenic viewpoint, so humans are still involved. Preservation biologists tend to take a much more ecocentric viewpoint. They try to keep humans out of areas that we haven't already damaged, and they focus on preventing the ecological problem from happening in the first place. Don't fix it after the fact. Remember the ecocentric viewpoint, nature has rights and we shouldn't be harming it, sustainable or not. And just in general, guys, preservation is often a more difficult option than conservation. We're going to take a look at some examples of conservation organizations, and more specifically, exactly how they work. So these are any organization that works to conserve or preserve biodiversity and the environment, and these could be considered to be local, global, or both. A lot of these larger organizations have national branches and also regional and local offices, even though they're large international organizations. There's several acronyms that we should know what they mean. The first one here is an IGO. This stands for Intergovernmental Organization. These are composed of, or sometimes they just answer to, a group of various countries. They're sometimes also called international organizations, and some examples that we've talked about are the UN, the IUCN, or the IPCC. Next, we've got GEOs. This stands for Governmental Organization. These are typically part of the government, or sometimes they're funded by only one national government. They tend to be highly bureaucratic, and they're often focused on research, regulation, or monitoring and control of activities within that particular country. Examples would be the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA from the United States, or the Environmental Protection Department of China. Last one we've got here is the NGO. This stands for Non-Governmental Organization. These are typically not part of any government. They're not for profit. They could be international or local, and oftentimes they're funded by donations or subscriptions paid for by civilians. They're oftentimes run by volunteers. They tend to be very diverse, and some examples are Greenpeace or Friends of the Earth. Let's take a look at some of the various approaches to conservation, so some conservation methods or techniques. And really there's three basic approaches to conservation. You've got species-based, which we're going to take a look at here first, and then you've got habitat-based, and then the third one is actually a mixture of both of those. So your species-based conservation, this type of conservation focuses on conserving the species, but doesn't look at conserving the habitat, interestingly, in which the species lives. So we're going to take a look at 5 examples of species-based conservation, and we're going to start here with CITES. So the acronym CITES stands for the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. It's a mouthful. So as you can see here, this was an international agreement between governments to address the international trade of endangered species, and it was actually pretty effective at reducing the trade of endangered species and parts. So unfortunately, around the world, many species are becoming endangered because of illegal international trade, and CITES was created between governments to address this problem. Couple tidbits here. Governments sign up to CITES voluntarily upon their own accord, and the goal of CITES is to simply ensure that international trade of specimens or wild animals and plants doesn't in any way threaten their survival. Just a few examples of the types of organisms that are targeted by CITES. You've got your live animal imports and exports, for example, tortoises. You've also got your various animal parts. Some of these that we've heard about might include elephant tusks being traded and rhino horns. There are also some things in there that we might not think about. You've got plants such as orchids that are illegal to trade, as well as mahogany wood. The species are grouped by CITES according to how threatened they are by international trade policies. They're organized according to their endangered status in 3 articles. Article 1 species are not allowed to be traded internationally at all because they're actually threatened with extinction. Article 2 species, they can be traded internationally, but they have to follow strict regulations and guidelines that ensure that species sustainability. And your Article 3 species, these are included at the request of a country, which then asks for the cooperation of the other countries that joined CITES to help the original country prevent illegal exploitation. So your Article 3 species are only going to be restricted if the other countries that signed up for CITES agree to restrict it. Next, we're going to take a look at captive breeding programs and zoos. So we're thinking here examples like zoos and aquariums where people would go view organisms outside of their natural habitats. These types of facilities can, of course, keep many different examples of species, including endangered ones. But obviously, it's impossible to keep every species that's endangered. There are some problems with these types of approaches. For example, they can often be really expensive, they can be difficult, and they're actually not always successful. For example, even if they can breed the species that they keep within their confines, they often have difficulty, and it's not exactly a straightforward process to reintroduce the species into the wild. Zoos do attract a lot of attention, and they provide education to the general public, but of course sometimes they do get bad press, especially when the animals that are in the zoo are kept in close confinement or in small cages or with cruelty. You've also got the problem of zoos needing to keep the megafauna, the charismatic megafauna is what we call it. These are things like giraffes, elephants, hippos, rhinos, polar bears. This is what the public is paying for to go see oftentimes. It is what pays the bills, but people aren't going to pay to see beetles and worms, even though these organisms can be just as important to their natural environments. Lastly, you've got this idea of a frozen zoo. This is a storage facility for various animal tissues. It is what they say cryopreserved, which means it's frozen at really low temperatures for long periods of time. And in theory, the animals that become extinct could be stored here with the idea that they can then be raised from this genetic material and then bred in zoos and reintroduced later on. But in practice, this has proven to be extremely difficult, and there are many issues involved with this process. Next, we'll take a look at botanical gardens and seed banks. Botanical gardens are controlled gardens which grow, identify, conserve, research, and educate the public on various species. The largest botanical garden in the world is the Royal Botanical Gardens, which is located in London, England. They've got 25,000 different plant species there, which is actually 10% of the world's known total of plant species. And they've got 1% of the world's threatened plant species. So the point is, while they do have 10% of the known plant species, only 1% of those that they have are endangered. They're not necessarily dedicated to preserving endangered species. Seed banks store frozen seeds for many years in case of natural hazards or disasters or extinction events, but the concern can often be who then owns the seeds that are stored there. There are many seed banks around the world. Oftentimes countries will have their own national seed banks, but there are also international collections. The largest seed bank in the world is located here in Norway. It's funded by an international organization called the Global Crop Diversity Trust, as well as the Norwegian government. It's been built so that it extends within the permafrost, so it doesn't actually need any power to keep the seeds frozen. Here we can see the entrance to this facility. The next approach that we'll take a look at is the flagship species approach. This uses media to capture the public's attention, and they often appeal to the public with cute photos or charismatic megafauna. Most of the flagship species used by corporations or NGOs are large and furry, but they may also not have a significant role in the ecosystem where they live. For example, if they disappeared, the rest of the community would be little affected. Sometimes they can be used as so-called umbrella species, which which means that their conservation would help others in their habitat. But like I said, oftentimes they take focus away from more threatened species. But the purpose of them is so that they have an instant appeal to the public, and they're often used simply to ask for money, which is then used to protect the habitat. Next, we've got keystone species. These are species that play a critical, super important role in maintaining the structure of the ecosystem in which they live. So these are oftentimes very different from flagship species. Their loss could result in total ecosystem collapse, so they may get more attention than other species. A common theme amongst keystone species is that they tend to be predators or quote-unquote engineers in the ecosystems that they live in. An example is sea otters, which eat sea urchins. Sea urchins eat kelp, which provides home to many organisms in the ecosystem. So if you removed the sea otters, the sea urchins eat all the kelp, which removes the entire habitat, and therefore it would destroy the ecosystem. Here we've got a picture of a sea otter, and you can see on the right there an example of the habitat with sea otters, keeping the sea urchins in check, and without the sea otters, letting the sea urchins run wild. So that concludes our look at the 5 examples of species-based conservation, and now we're going to take a look at habitat conservation. So like the name would imply, habitat conservation preserves the space, which indirectly preserves the species that live there. It's often focused on designing, building, and managing protected areas. For example, many nature preserves protect every single living thing inside of a large natural area. Some questions that often pop up when dealing with the habitat protection approach to conservation are things such as how large should the protected area be? And is it better to have one really large area or many smaller protected reserves? And don't forget, we have to take into account something that we previously learned called the edge effect. So the large or small habitat conservation area debate is often abbreviated with the acronym SLOSS, S-L-O-S-S. This stands for single large or several small. One vocab word that we should definitely make sure we know is ecotone. So edge effects occur at what we call ecotones. Ecotones are the place where 2 habitats meet, and there's a change near the boundary of the ecotone. Corridors are pieces of land that are engineered and built specifically to connect 2 smaller conservation areas. These allow individuals in various populations to move from one reserve to another, and it allows for seasonal migrations to occur. Also, many reserves have so-called buffer zones around them. These allow for a transitional area between the reserve and unprotected areas where you might have things like selective logging occurring or agriculture. This tends to lessen the edge effects around a nature reserve, and it leaves the core of the reserve to be undisturbed. Some questions that are often asked when designing nature preserves are how big should they be? Is it better to have one big one or many small ones? That's the SLOSS. How many individuals of an endangered species have to be protected to ensure that species survival? What's the best shape? If there are several reserves, how close do they need to be to each other? Should they be joined by corridors, or should they have buffer zones around them? And once again, we've reached the end of the notes. Don't forget the 3 questions in the margin and your summary at the end.